I'll turn this over to my very distinguished colleague, Todd Jick, who is much adored by his students for organizational change and rebellion, I heard, Todd. So.
And what else?
And rebellion.
And rebellion. All right, good afternoon. How's the energy level for the rest of the day? Okay, good, because we have a fabulous panel here. I'm delighted to be here to moderate this. I'm delighted to see so many of my current and past students here, and they've all taken org change, so they're going to be right in the mix of this. And I can tell my students, and as I introduce the panel, you're in for, I think, a very stimulating afternoon with these three panelists. I've been at this field for about 35 years, so I'm just trying to get my bicycle wheels moving here. But I've never been in a situation where I actually was the big question. I was the big question for a number of years, but now I've reached the big question. So reaching this level is a great pinnacle of my career. What we've assembled this afternoon are people who have been there and done that or seen that. This morning we had the research perspective on it. This afternoon we're going to bridge sort of research and practice, which all of you know is what I do for a living. And we brought three people who have really deep understandings of their organizations and deep understandings of organizational change. So it really gives us an opportunity to understand this subject from those on the front line. As people who are on the front line, let me give you quick introductions and then just say a word about sort of the subject matter from my standpoint. So I'll start with Lauren Chesley, who's next to me here. Lauren is the Director of Change Execution. She said, I say that with more feeling than anybody else has said about that title, Change Execution. But you know, for me, when somebody has change in their title, I mean, it brings joy and merriment to me. So the Director of Change Execution, we'll find out shortly what that means. She's been doing it since December 2011. Previously, she was at Merck and an external consultant in the organizational change field before that. So someone that is actually a founder and creator of a change management center of excellence is how I would characterize what Lauren is doing. And so she has a major set of responsibilities. Only 190,000 employees at Verizon. Only about what a number of VPs, 300 VPs and higher that are her clients, and really an industry that's obviously in the middle of all sorts of interesting changes. So, Lauren, we're delighted to have you here, and we'll hear your story shortly. Seated next to her is Nancy DeViney. Nancy and I have sort of crisscrossed indirectly for many years through mutual colleagues. Nancy, she described to me on the phone that she's 38 and a half years at IBM. You see, if you've been there that long, you throw in the half. We could round it up or round it down, depending on how you want to do it, but 38 and a half years at IBM. Most of her career as a general manager on the line side, but for the last 8.5 years, working in the sort of change management area. And in fact, one of my studies, one of my pieces of research, is to look at companies that actually have titles with change management in it. Change execution here. Your formal title is... You tell me if I find it, organization change management, but it's in the enterprise transformation group. So those words are right in there. So for my students and otherwise, that's very exciting again to hear that. These last 8.5 years have been pretty interesting years for IBM. Now we're talking about how many employees at IBM? 190,000 at Verizon. How many at IBM? Not the IBMers. How many at IBM? Guesses? 300,000? 500,000? Do I hear 600,000? 600,000 going once. Do we have 600,000? No. 420,000 employees, 25,000 worldwide. So, and Nancy has been through certainly three very prominent CEOs, from Lou Gerstner to Sam to Ginny these days. And so she's been a part of regime changes, and all of them have had the change theme. All of them had major areas that she's been involved in, but particularly these last 8 years. So we'll hear about her story and her function. So these two stories are really about life on the front line of change management. Steve Mandis brings a different perspective. Steve worked at Goldman Sachs for 20 years. He's now an adjunct faculty for us here at Columbia Business School. And Steve was an observer of change that wasn't always planned. And in fact, has written a very interesting new book called, if I can promo it, What Happened to Goldman Sachs, just came out. an insider story of organizational drift and its unintended consequences, which is about the fact that Goldman Sachs changed, but maybe not wittingly. So organizations change planfully, but they also change unwittingly. And what happens under those circumstances? And having changed unwittingly, do you then wittingly need to make any adjustments? Did it change in the right direction? The word organizational drift sort of suggests maybe not, but Steve's careful in the book to say, I'm not making that judgment either way. So Steve will bring us a perspective of the Goldman Sachs story. He's been a banker. He's been involved with Citibank and Wall Street activities, so brings a sort of insider's perspective that way. So the three of you, rich experiences, been there, done that, seen that. We're not going to have enough time, but we'll hear a bit of their stories. Let me do three quick slides to get us started. The stats. My students' success rate of change in organizations. What number? Good to see that all those weeks of work. I'm asking one question. 30%. Now this morning, who mentioned 50%? Damon, I think, mentioned 50%, my colleague who teaches organization change. There was an IBM study I'm going to refer to here which says 41% success. Is that a good number or a bad number? Not good. Doesn't seem like there's a betting person you'd want that. But when you get underneath it, something very interesting that we want to probe for in this session. The theme of why is change so hard is because in 20% of these examples, there were novices, and their success rate was lower. So in the case of, actually it's not 20% of the 41%, but in the case of 20% of success was only in the case of people who were novices, in a sense, who got lucky. So your success is going to go even further down if you're not well skilled in this. We're going to learn about what skills it takes. On the other hand, change masters, 80% success rate. So although 40% or something like that is the overall statistic, it varies greatly depending on how you do it. And our theme today is about the how. I did a study some years ago about groups that were going out to make change. They worked sort of time one on planning for change. 9 months later, I interviewed them and I said, how's it going? Here's what they said. We underestimated the resistance and the key constituencies. We underestimated the time required. We underestimated the skills and resources needed, and we underestimated project leadership. That's all we underestimated, okay? Just those things. But not to worry, they overestimated something too. They overestimated the clarity of their plan. Now, that's a bad combination of underestimating and overestimating. So again, beating the odds, learning the art and the science of this is what this session is all about. And last slide is that I want to bridge forward with what I think we're going to hear with some hopes. The original question, why is change so hard, is a concerning question, but I wouldn't be doing this for 30 years if I felt like it's mission impossible. So I think the notion of hope is embedded in what we're going to hear today too, because we have the notion of some professionalism building in this profession. Many of you here appreciate that, and these two women, in the various functions and centers they've created, are building the capabilities of their organization. So more professionalism, more centers of excellence, two of them represented here. And thirdly, more science and art, the appreciation that there is a science. So I want to frame what we're doing in terms of the reality is it's not good odds, but it can be better odds if you have the trained and put it in the hands of people who are well equipped. And in fact, we're more confident now that we can build this as a center of excellence to deal with all the change going on that Damon started this morning to talk about. So that's what I want to pose as sort of a backdrop. And Lauren, I'm going to have you start. I'll move the mic over to you when I finish with the question. But basically, I just want to ask each of you, particularly Lauren and Nancy to begin with, what kind of brought you to sort of change management? What's intriguing about it? What's made this sort of your professional niche now? And then Steve, to ask you kind of what you saw at Goldman in terms of change that got you intrigued enough to write a book on it. Lauren.
Thanks, Todd. So the short answer of how I got into the profession, you guys hear me okay? I started in another profession and turned out that I was not well suited for that profession. I began my career in clinical work, and I had a real love for psychology and it lent itself very nicely to this notion of how do people move through high stress situations, how do they deal with ambiguity, how do we help people change to new ways of working, new ways of living, those kinds of things. When I got into the clinical setting, my patients were quick to tell me, as were my mentors, that this was not the profession for me. There's a dose of empathy that's required with doing clinical work that I lacked, and so there was a need to quickly move to another field. And as often happens with careers, as I've discovered longer in my career, it ends up being less planned than you think it's going to be when you get into school. And as a planner, this doesn't sit well with me. But I was invited to work in consulting, general management consulting, and was asked if I would be part of the change management practice. It seemed to fit with my education. And so that was how I found myself in the discipline. When they asked me to do it, I said, I don't even know what change management is. I never thought I'd even be in corporate America. And so I was on a steep learning curve, but I quickly realized that I could take what I had learned in my education and apply it to corporate settings with varying degrees of success and varying degrees of receptivity. Why do I stay in the profession is a question that I usually ask myself every day around 8 o'clock at night driving home. And others of you as practitioners might also have that same drive home and dialogue with yourself. Because it's not for the faint of heart, as we talked about, and extremely difficult, but I love the challenge of trying to influence others in the spirit of getting business results, and I have an insatiable desire to do that. To be able to do it at a company as iconic as Verizon and make the contributions to our customers that I know we can feels like a real privilege for me, so that's why I continue to do it every day.
And when they offered you this director of change execution, and you had been doing something similar at Merck, but what did you think it was? What appealed to you about actually taking on that kind of a prominent position?
There had not been a practice, a formal change management discipline at Verizon prior to December of 2011 when I joined, and so I loved the opportunity of building something from scratch and doing it at a company that is so results-oriented and so driven to do something better. It was interesting, Todd and I were speaking. When I was in pharma, there was a real business case. There was something to really latch onto around why we needed to change, and so they needed me there. To come to a company as successful as Verizon, I quickly realized they might not be particularly receptive to the idea, right? Hugely successful company. We seem to be doing okay, Lauren, without you and whatever you want to talk about. But much to my surprise, they were very interested in learning more about it, but it meant that we had to describe for them what it was, my team and I, and the value that it would bring. And so it's important to think about how do you position this with your clients or in the work that you do so that it resonates with them and really rings true for them. I'm not a big fan of the notion of change management and calling it that. I'm not sure what to call it, which is embarrassing when you can't figure out what to even call what you do for a living. But change management feels really reactive to me. It feels like there's a problem that now we have to go manage and solve for versus this notion of change execution or change leadership, which feels a little more proactive to me, that we can do something in advance of making that change that will increase our odds for success. So that's the genesis of the name of the organization, Change Execution.
Thank you very much. Nancy.
Great. Okay, great. Well, thank you for this opportunity. This is a great opportunity to be here with all of you. Thank you for joining the discussion. So I was about 30 years into my IBM career when I sort of hit one of these midlife career crossroads and had to make a decision about what to do next in IBM. And I kind of put two desires out there. One was to lead either another growth play for the company, because I just helped IBM with a growth play around e-learning. That was a cross-enterprise play, and I really enjoyed doing that. And I had been a general manager in the business, had P&L experience. So I said I'd love to do that, or I'd love to work on a systemic challenge for the company. So I kind of put those two intentions out there, and opportunities came in both arenas. But ultimately what IBM asked me to do was to come inside to a corporate role and to help us advance our values-based culture. Our CEO at the time, Sam Palmisano, had 3 years earlier engaged the entire IBM workforce in an online interactive dialogue that we call a JAM, a massive online dialogue where hundreds of thousands of employees go in and they basically share their ideas on what they thought our core values should become. And so our core values had been recreated, but IBM needed someone to come in and really help our leaders pay attention to culture change, pay attention to how we would get these values into the operations and behaviors of the company. So that's the initial role that they asked me to come inside and work on, was around culture change. And we did a whole field of work on that for about 3 years. We made tremendous progress. It's still a work in progress today. I'll tell you, nurturing culture is always something that you're working at. But about 3 years in, they said to me, look, why don't you expand that work that you're doing, expand the team into this whole field of organizational change management, because we are yet again transforming ourselves as a company in some profound ways around our business model, our operating model, and the culture yet again. And so we feel that this is a discipline that we need to get better and better at as a core competency as a company. So at that point, about 5 years ago, I expanded the practice beyond the focus on the values-based culture into this broader field of organizational change management and change leadership. So the thing that kind of has gotten me excited about this is I've gotten into the field and surrounded myself by people that are smart academically and professionally in this field, and how we make this relevant for our leaders is, number one, I feel like I get to work in one of the greatest sandboxes on the planet in terms of transformational change, not just incremental change, but I work for an institution, a great institution and a great company that is known for progress, is known for change. And again, we have profoundly changed our business model and our operating model, our workforce, our culture. So that's kind of the first thing, and it was intriguing to me to help IBM raise its game at how we do change. The second thing that sort of intrigued me was this idea about how do you actually scale this idea and this discipline of change leadership and organizational change management. How do you do that at scale? In an enterprise that operates in 170 countries around the world, has 425,000 employees, many of which don't come to IBM offices every day. And so how do we reach them and help engage them broadly and at scale in change? So I thought that would be kind of a unique challenge. And then the third piece was this idea of how can we innovate in the field of change management. So the team that I have the pleasure of leading and working with day to day are people that come into work every day and we're thinking about how do we do change better? How do we land it in a way that people will understand it, can adapt to it more easily, and how do we actually apply technology to the change process? So that's kind of what's been intriguing to me in this opportunity and this, what I think is really a whole new field of work.
And do internal units call you and say, come on down, help us, we're making a major change? Does Ginny or somebody else sort of anoint you and put you in there? How does that work?
There's two ways that my team, and again, my team is not a massive team. I have a team of about 16 people on the team that are all steeped academically and professionally in this field. And in addition to building out at scale the capability in the company, first of all, we wanted to put ourselves in place to teach the rest of the company to fish. So rather than doing the fishing for them when it comes to change leadership and change management. So, we have trained out over 50,000 IBM managers, leaders, project managers, HR partners, communication specialists on some of the fundamentals of change leadership and change management. And then we've deeply trained about 3,500 people in the company on our methodology called Better Change for IBM. So while we were skilling them, two things happened on the project front. We were actually assigned as a team to kind of parachute in and look at the change programs for some of the most strategic initiatives in the company that were that had to get executed well. There was no tolerance for these things not delivering on results or failing. So we did parachute in, rolled up our sleeves, helped them construct the right kind of change programs that would ensure business impact. The second thing that would happen is the phone started ringing, and some people wanted coaching of the people that we had trained on their teams. Gee, my team's doing it, but this is their first time. Can you show up and kind of coach us? Or they asked us for some targeted help. Could you come in and help us get the plan right, and then I think we can execute it. Or you can come in and we have this change program, it's not going so well. Would you audit it for us? Would you tell us what's working, what isn't, and help us shore it up? Or would you help us understand how things are getting adopted? So it was kind of this blend of we're assigned, we're skilling people up, we're coaching, we're doing a whole blend of things across the team.
And now also for external clients.
Yes, so we also have a team of hundreds of people around the world that are organizational change management consultants, and so we share with our external consulting team our learnings from internal, but my team also goes out now and we actually share what we're learning with our clients. Lauren and I do a lot of collaboration together, but we really share what we're learning, and we also do this work for clients as well on a billable basis.
All right, Steve, let's put you in the mix. So Steve brings a unique combination of being kind of a banker by his professional background, but an emergent sociologist who, while at Goldman, was sort of observing all sorts of things happening. So you're not a change agent, you're not building a change center of excellence, but you observe some interesting things at Goldman. Tell us kind of your story, kind of your perspective, and what you began to see there.
Okay. I started at Goldman in 1992. It was a relatively domestic investment banking, advisory services, predominantly business. And through my career, I then went to work internationally for Goldman, and then I finished my career at Goldman as a portfolio manager in the largest proprietary trading area. So my career in many ways actually reflects the change that happened with Goldman, moving from a US-focused banking firm to an international banking firm to proprietary trading. And to be perfectly honest, during all of that, I never really thought about the change. I was working 100 hours a week. There were massive changes that happened that did stimulate the question, but I quickly put my head down and went back to doing my daily job. So there were a couple of major events that happened in 1994. Many people don't realize this, but Goldman actually was teetering on financially going bankrupt. 1/3 of the firm's partners retired in order to protect their capital. Their capital base went down 50 to 60% in a few months. I'd been there for 2 years, and I was saying I better start looking for a new job. That's pretty hard to imagine that's not that long ago that Goldman was like that. Then Goldman went through a major transformation, which was the IPO. Goldman Sachs was a private firm. It had turned down going public many times, and then in 1999 it decided to go public, which accelerated a lot of other changes. And then I wound up leaving. We had to stay at Goldman for 5 years in order for our stock to fully vest from the IPO, and I stayed there for the 5 years, left, started a firm with basically the help of Goldman people, and then 3 or 4 years later, my partners and I sold it for close to $1 billion and hired Goldman to do it. So I don't have any bad feelings about leaving Goldman or anything else. So people find it shocking that I wrote a book. So in 1979, John Whitehead, who was running the firm, said, well, I'm going to write down 12 business principles. This was very avant-garde on Wall Street. No one had any. And he wrote down the first business principle: we always put our clients' interests first. Who in this room today thinks that Goldman Sachs always puts their clients' interests first? You see, I don't see anybody about. Okay.
Give him time to think about it, though, Steve,
so,
just in case.
That principle is the same exact. Actually, the principles that were written, there were originally 10. They changed it to 12 because they thought 10 commandments, 10 principles may seem bad, but so those principles are essentially the same today. So it's a fascinating case, right? Because the principles have stayed the same. The firm had a goal in 1979 become the leading advisor to major corporations and institutional investing clients. The same goal today. But here in the room, there's no one that believes they always put their clients' interests first. If I'm in a room with the top executives at Goldman and I ask them the same exact question, all hands. They 100% believe that they always put their clients' interests first. I found this fascinating. And I think when, after I sold my company, I decided to become an academic. So I teach in the business school, and I'm also trying to get a PhD in sociology, studying organizations. I just thought it was kind of an interesting question as to how that happens, and then all of a sudden, you turn on the TV and Lloyd Blankfein's in Congress being questioned about Goldman's practices, including how they treat clients. So at the same time, all these Goldman Sachs partners and people that I sort of am in the group with all are asking the same question: did the culture change? everyone had their own opinion, and everyone sort of thought it was the IPO. The IPO changes, the organizational structural change that happened. So I thought that was sort of an interesting academic question. So with the sort of help and guidance of many of my professors and people within the business school, or I don't want to say they're colleagues because they're true academics, but they encouraged me to look into this question. And so what I started to do was question, did the culture at Goldman Sachs change, yes or no? Which is a very difficult question to answer, so you have to think about a framework for that. And then you have to answer the following questions: why did it change and how did it change? Right. And so I stumbled into a number of sort of other interesting questions and theories and ideas that I never contemplated while I was at the firm. Some people may argue that's a part of the actual social normalization process so that you don't see the changes. But that's kind of, I started stumbling into it. And then the book is really the foundation of my dissertation.
But it is an interesting contrast, because the work that Nancy, Lauren, and that I do, both in my teaching and my consulting, is all about planful change. We're all trying to control the variables, have people, as we've talked about all day, behave differently. This is about an organization that you observed that actually changed, again, through all sorts of events, decisions, circumstances, but it didn't have a leader or a rudder that was, in fact, guiding it. But right. All organizations are going to be changing all the time, regardless of what we do as change agents. Right. And you captured that very well in your book, and then you called it drift, because organizations without some direction, again, go wherever they're going to go.
Right. So what I point to is that there are people who are directing change, or managers or leaders who say we want to go from point A to point B. If anyone who's ever been on a boat and they say I want to get from point A to point B, and you just draw a straight line and you try to follow that straight line, which is what I think many executives or leaders take for granted, that we're charging full steam ahead on the straight line. What I found is that doesn't work, because just like on a boat, there are these currents that are going on. The wind, the currents, the size of the boat, the materials of the boat, all impact you. So you're not actually going to be able to go on a straight line. You're going to drift. And so for someone to say we want to go from point A to point B, what the book comes out, what I learned is that you need to take into account I've come up with 4 things, and some of which have been, I think all of which have been mentioned today: technological pressures, regulatory pressures, organizational pressures, and competitive pressures. And all those pressures are impacting the ability to change in the way that you may want to. And so many of the people I spoke to at Goldman were not taking into account these facts. And then the last thing was the law of large numbers. So the law of large numbers, as Goldman got larger and larger and larger, really impacted the firm's ability to change and how it changed and everything else. So I find it very fascinating, because these very large organizations are so focused on it. And the larger and larger these companies get, obviously the more complexity and difficulty it is to stay or to get to where you want to go.
So those of you that want to continue to be observers of organizations, Steve gives us a lot of insight into how things might unfold. But for those of us that don't have that luxury, that have to, in fact, try and get our organization from point A to point B, I'm going to ask Lauren first and then Nancy about sort of your own sort of insights over many years of looking at this as to the kind of do's and don'ts, sort of the must-haves and the non-obvious mistakes to avoid. But what can you give us as insights into this whole question of how we should go about doing it, to the extent that we can guide it in some way? Why don't you start, Lauren?
Sure. I appreciate that you bring up this notion of how you do it versus the what you do. And it came up this morning, and I was thrilled when I saw that slide as well, because that for me is really the linchpin in all of this. That I'm not going to sit here. First of all, I'm humbled to be here and a part of this today. So I would hardly call myself an expert. I'd call myself a novice at best, having done this for as many years as I have. And despite my years of experience, I don't have a 5 steps, 10 steps, 6 steps, tools that I would say, do this and you'll end up in a different place. You guys all know the exact same tools, and we all use the same stuff every day, right? Verizon has built an internal change practice like IBM has, but when Nancy and I compare notes, there's not some wild variation between the two. For me, the secret sauce is much more in how you use the tools, how you use the principles to get the outcome. And for me, it's really about the way in which you show up as a practitioner more than anything else. My personal view may be unfavorable or not particularly popular, but I don't think that everyone is well suited to do this work. I think there's a certain type of individual that has a propensity and a bent and lends itself better to trying to engage with senior leaders to influence their thinking, to navigate all of those currents that Steve was talking about as much as possible to get the outcome. In the same way that all physicians go to medical school, there's some doctors that you'd rather not see and who aren't as capable as others. And I think the same thing applies in the change practice, and it's called a practice for that very reason. You know, we're constantly trying to learn. But for me, it's much less about technical skill and much more about the authenticity that you show up with, the vulnerability that you show up with, the trust that you build with leaders so that you're in that empowered relationship with them and can drive the way that they're thinking and partner with them. I work for them to make their vision come to life as much as possible. And so every suggestion that I make, every tool that I use, every mitigation that I put forward, any solution is all aimed at making that happen. And I don't pretend to control it in any way. I've worked through my own therapy on the control issues, but I don't tell anyone that I have control of it. That you'll never hear me say I've got this under control, because it's just impossible in the highly complex organizations that we work in. And so you need the education to learn the fundamentals of how you do it, but then I went out through my career and just found myself bosses or mentors that I studied their every move to see what they did and how they did it successfully. And when they said something that I thought to myself, yeah, I'll never say that. I've learned from that lesson that that's not what you say. And then also where they were highly successful in shifting people's perspective and helping them to see things through a different lens and changing people's frames of reference and getting them to consider ways of doing things that at face value and as a leader who's trying to drive the straight line as quickly as possible so that they can get on to the next thing. How do you help them realize that that path is not the one that's going to get you there, and I'm going to have to take you on a different path, and it's probably going to take 6 times as long? That's not a popular message to deliver, right? Nobody's like, oh, 6 times longer, fantastic, let's start today. So I don't have an easy way to do it, and so consequently, since most of the time my job is to deliver bad news, because change is all about the challenges that we face, how do you do it in a way that they invite you back again and don't say, like, bad news, lady, you're no fun to be around, and every time I get together with you, you have more bad news to tell me about what's happening with the change. So what's the challenge and what's the solution, and how do you get them committed to doing something that might not be the most popular path?
And Nancy may talk about this in a moment too, about sort of building up change capabilities, but I'm just staying with your theme for a moment, because I think one of the new dimensions of change management is not so much a new insight into a technique, as you're saying, but rather into the person that delivers it, the change agents, the change leaders, et cetera. And you and I talked on the phone a bit about that more and more of the real question is, do you have the right constitution, the right qualities and the like to be able to do this? It's not for the faint of heart. The scars do come with it. There's heavy tolerance of ambiguity and uncertainty. There's a lot. If you do want to try, and it's not so much captain the ship, but even just be anywhere near that steering wheel to do. So what qualities are you looking for? What are the qualifications that would be highest on your list?
Sure. I think first and foremost, there's a need for a high degree of resiliency, and I think that exists whether you're practicing as a change agent or just trying to be a human and get through life. Resiliency above all else, an ability to deal with also a high degree of ambiguity and feeling really comfortable in that space, because very rarely is what we think going to happen what actually ends up happening. I think the way in which you sell solutions, and I mentioned earlier the notion of vulnerability and authenticity and trust, and the way that you position yourself in a partnership with the leader that makes them bring you in such a way that you have insights that you wouldn't otherwise have had, that then inform the recommendations that you make. Nancy can speak eloquently to the work that she's doing to build the capability, but as someone who runs a change practice for a large company, I'm constantly asking myself, can I give someone these tools and assume that they'll be able to go off and do it? Nancy was saying, I have people calling me saying, we're using them, but maybe it's not going so well. Can you come in and tell us what we should be doing differently? And if you're trying to build the organizational awareness up around the value this brings, you do yourself a huge discredit if you give tools to someone who is not a seasoned practitioner. Then I've created a mess, and I have now some number of leaders who don't think that this is worth anything, right? I've just validated what they originally thought, which is this is a big waste of time. And so there's a real balance between how do you find a way to upskill an organization, because if you've got a team of 16 or you've got a team of 20, you can't do it all on your own, but you're limited in how you go about that. So Nancy, can share her thoughts.
Okay, great. So I think the original question was some of the things we've learned about managing change, and then I'll touch on this as well. I gave some thought to this before coming here, and I think, if I had to say some of the big three things I've learned coming from, again, the business leadership side into this discipline area and then helping other business leaders. The first thing that is kind of top of mind for me is the fact that change leadership really is the essential work of business leaders. And if you take that as your underlying premise, you start to think about how can we help our leadership team of the company become better at this. A lot of them think they're pretty good at it. And so one of the challenges that you have is to show up and say, okay, tell me about your change history. What's worked well for you that you've implemented? Maybe where did you come up short? Try to have some of those conversations with them. And what you usually uncover in those discussions is most leaders have had a range of things happen here where some things went well and some things didn't, and they're usually pretty honest about that. And if you can show up and say, gee, maybe there's some new things, some new techniques, some new ideas, some new ways of thinking about change, would you be open to that if it could help you get the business outcomes that you're looking for? And so one of the things about change leadership that we've learned is that, first of all, we have to infuse some training on this into the core leadership development programs of the company. So it's got to become embedded. This has to become seen as an essential skill set. And you're not trying to make them organizational change management consultants, but you're trying to give them some ideas about how we can change the way we're doing change in a much more collaborative and social enterprise. That's very different than the enterprises that a lot of us had grown up in, right? The world is moving to more collaboration, more social. How can you actually get them to think about not just deploying change at their organization, but actually driving adoption? So people are actually shifting to the new ways of working and it's being sustained. And how can you actually not drive change through compliance and barking out an order and thinking everybody's going to follow suit to this arena of how do you actually drive commitment? These are some really profound questions that when you engage with leaders on this, they start to think about, gee, maybe there are some new things that we should be thinking about here. So I think that's the first thing. The second thing is that we have learned that you really do need a discipline. Now, what was behind that IBM study of why only 40% of transformations fail? There was more to that study of about 1,500 companies, because we went on to say when change works well, or when you're in the change master category, what's going on? And what's going on in that category when 80% of the projects are being successful is that you find that people actually are using a method. They're using a discipline. And so when I show up with leaders who, as soon as you say the word method, they kind of freeze and go, it's consulting speak, this sounds heavy-handed, what is this? I've changed my language with them to say, there's a checklist. Can we use if you use the checklist and you do these things and you iterate on this, your outcomes are going to be more in the 80% plus range than in the 40% range. And most leaders want their projects to be successful. So again, it's telling them enough about the discipline, but putting it in business language and then making sure they have people on their teams that are more trained in the methodology, in the discipline, again, shored up by, Center of Excellence, kind of a team that can really assist them. Help them even unpack how complex is this change you're about to implement. Just getting them to dialogue about who will be impacted and how complex and how much risk is in this, and have you thought about the downstream effects of this on the people that actually have to implement it. This is where, you can have some very rich dialogue. So I think this idea of discipline is important. The other thing that's behind the going from 40% success to 80%, it's the method and the discipline, it's having skilled resource, and it's putting some budget on this. I mean, most leaders know that when they're going to implement a project, they have to have project management. They kind of get that, and they kind of budget for that. But very few of them budget for change management. And they don't know the difference between change management and project management. So again, we show up and say 10 to 11% of your budget for this project should be on the change program. Did you know that? And you get into some discussions about, well, what kind of stuff will you be doing? Or what kind of things would the change team be doing? And then they come to realize how important it really is. And then the third thing is that we have really learned that for this to get traction and to scale in an enterprise, it has to be worked into the fabric of how things are done in the enterprise. So in other words, what we talk about at meetings, do we only talk about the projects and what's on time, on schedule? Do we ever talk about adoption? How is this going through the eyes of the end users? And you have to kind of change the discussion. And so we've worked very hard to build discussions and conversations into the management system about not only what we're changing, what we're implementing initiative-wise, but how it's going through the eyes of the users. And where do we have adoption issues? One of the most difficult conversations, or questions, I should say, that Sam Palmisano used to ask me, we'd be in some reviews with him as a CEO, and he'd say, why is this taking so long? Because, CEOs, once they formulate the ideas and the strategy, they want it executed now with speed, right? And they think everybody's going to, and we would sit there as initiative teams saying, well, the people over here kind of are getting in, this team's a little slow. We didn't really have much precision around that conversation. So we realized, being a very data-driven organization, we better start getting data. And so we shifted ourselves into this mode of adoption metrics, not just studying when we've deployed a change, but how do we know when people are adopting and sticking with the new ways of working? And so we now have in our management system, talk about being embedded again in the fabric of the company, in the management system we look at deployment metrics, we look at adoption metrics, and we look at business impact. And really adoption is a leading indicator of business impact anyway. So these are some of the things that we've learned, and we have had a huge learning around engaging employees in change through social business tools. We do a lot of this, whether it's those massive online jam kind of dialogues that can be scaled around a project or around a whole company dialogue on something like the core values. But we have 75,000 online communities of practice in IBM today. One of them I run, which is called the Better Change for IBM Community. So as people go through our training, if they want to self-affiliate to this online community of practice, they can. And we have 8,000 members across our company, across all those countries and business units, who collaborate in a dialogue. And in fact, last night I put a question out to my 8,000 community of practice on the fact that I was going to be here at Columbia speaking, and I used one of the questions that we had talked about ahead of time and fostered some collaboration around that with the community. Now, not all 8,000 responded, but plenty did, and again, it's a very vibrant, ongoing, collaborative discussion about what we're learning about change management.
Well, I mean, these are both, sort of interesting examples of success stories, and yours, Nancy, is over, again, a series of major change transformations, I mean, from product to service, and then the smarter planet, and globally integrated. There's been a lot at IBM. But again, sort of proactive efforts trying to find a community of people. I'm going to turn to Steve now and maybe try and throw a provocative question your way about the Goldman Sachs story, because in contrast, again, here's an example of a place that seemed to not have, for the most part, a planful change process. You didn't have a change center of excellence, yet it's been a successful company. We could say maybe it could have been more successful. But your book and this story is not the Kodak story. It's not the story of Circuit City, which I understand there's a new book, From Good to Great to Gone. This is not the story. I mean, your book still says, Goldman Sachs is still alive and thriving. It's a different kind of place. So What's your thought? I mean, should they have been managed this in a more active way? Did it come out all right anyway?
Yeah.
I mean, are we wasting our time with all the change management effort and training and everything else that we're doing?
It's actually a great question, because I sat with the executives at Goldman, and they adamantly told me that they don't believe that there's been a cultural change. And so as evidence for that, they said, 10 years ago or 20 years ago, we were number one in these key product areas. Today, we're number one in these key product areas.
Yeah.
Our return on shareholder equity is still the best on Wall Street. Goldman's brand recognition in terms of prestige of brand actually has gone up since the crisis. It's the highest it's ever been. The last thing was, this is a place, if you're an MBA student and you want to work on Wall Street or at a bank, there's still the number one place that people want to go work. So they said, Steve, I'm going to humor you. We don't think change has happened, but if it did happen, we're still the best, we're still the best. So what's the problem? Which was sort of an interesting question to get behind it. But what I started to go through the evidence that I found was that, when I started at the firm, the turnover at Goldman, it was known, I was someone who was a part of this, I received less compensation than my peers that worked at other firms. So I got paid less money, and the turnover was 5% approximately when I joined. Today, Goldman's compensation is at or above its peers, and turnover is 25%. Goldman 20 years ago did not underwrite a company that did not have 5 years of profits. The tech boom happened, and Goldman all of a sudden was underwriting e-toys, which had no profits. So I started going through these, and it actually was very interesting to go through with all the people, like all these policy changes that everyone thought were one-off, isolated things, one little thing here, one little thing there. And then I think the book has brought to people say, geez, there really has been this big shift in ownership, shift in the complexity in the organization, shift in different businesses. And so the question gets to, well, but we're still, number one, we're reaching many of our goals. What's the big deal? And I think this kind of goes to one of the reasons also I thought about the book was there's a professor in sociology, Diane Vaughan, who wrote this book about the Challenger, and the Challenger ultimately winds up, unfortunately, with the teacher on board exploding in front of our very eyes. And everyone's pointed as scientists saying, well, it was this thing called the O-rings. They had made this, engineers had made this error with this O-rings. And Diane went through and did extensive research, and she basically said that there was this incremental risk-taking or changes that were happening that nobody noticed, and they didn't notice it because of a process called social normalization, which is it's so incremental, nobody sees it. And this kind of went back to my Goldman, which is kind of why doesn't anyone see these changes? And the changes happen so slowly that nobody notices these changes until, unfortunately, there's a massive organizational failure. And so sometimes the failure is what drives it. But the interesting thing about Goldman is people argue, did the failure happen? Did it already during the crisis? Did it not happen? Is there a possibility? But there's all types of social issues related to this because we as taxpayers and people who are reliant on the financial system, if Goldman Sachs or one of the Wall Street firms had an organizational failure, which can happen with change, we're paying for it.
So let me use that as a bridge to another topic here, because if change management in the end tries to make the invisible more visible or put stuff out, then today's sort of technology enables us to access many more people much more readily. I mean, it's, in a way, probably even in those days, Steve, there was a lot of behind-the-scenes grumbling about Goldman isn't what it used to be. It's not, and yet maybe it just didn't make it into a senior-level issue that was addressed head-on. And money was being made, so you didn't have to. But just in terms of Lauren and Nancy, what you're doing, I mean, is today's sort of social technologies in other ways, you sent out your your blast last night, you got a bunch of replies. I mean, now it seems to me you can identify the take-up of change much more readily, the adoption rate. You can identify where there are bumps, where there are issues much more readily. There are all sorts of underground websites, more visible websites, et cetera. It's hard for these companies to sort of hide from what's going on. So where is that kind of affecting change management? Do you want to start, or
No, Nancy's much more an expert.
Because I think that's an interesting question.
Okay.
What's happening there? Because we can all learn from that. So I think a leading edge matter.
So if you were to open up the covers of IBM on any given day and sort of look inside at what's going on, what you would find is 50 million instant messages a day. I brought some of the stats with me. 50,000 wikis, 75,000 online communities of practice that people self-affiliate to based on their profession and the work they do or the clients that they serve. 105,000 people blogging, 475,000 files being shared, 30 million virtual meetings, meeting minutes per month. So it is this beehive. We are truly a social enterprise, and we are pushing forward to become even more of a social enterprise. And so, what can you do with this? And this is back to one of the things that intrigues me about this role is how can you apply that to the change process and to the change programs that you're designing? And if you think about that checklist that we give to leaders about how do you create a clear vision for the change that you're trying to execute, so people really understand the change and how it fits in the strategic context. How do you then, again, get the leadership team aligned? How do you get a coalition of change agents out there? How do you really get people enabled? How do you communicate? We think about every single step in the checklist and how we can apply social capabilities in IBM to the change process. And so we might tell them, look, early on while you're designing the change, why don't you engage people that are going to be impacted by the change? Reach out to them through the social channels and say, we're about to design this change. This is what we're thinking. What do you think? How would you design it? What do you think, some of the key elements of how we design this and execute it? What should they be? So make sure you're engaging people very early on, even as you're creating the change that you're going to execute. Once the change program gets going, again, we actually are piloting in the fourth quarter a little bit of what we're calling a change marketplace. People that are skilled up on change management that have some discretionary time that want to contribute as change agents to a program, or that perhaps want to actually do some of the change program work. They have some extra time on their hands and they'd actually like to help design and do some of the change program elements now that they've been trained in this. So again, we're thinking all along the way, every step. Once we roll out a program, we actually, rather than waiting 3 months and surveying people, how did the change go? How are you feeling? What worked? How was the education? We do it real time. So the people that are going to be impacted, we can invite them in. We can create one of these communities of practice for all of the new users of a new system, of a new application, of a process change. Invite them in day one and say, how's it going? The system's turned on, the new process is rolled out, how's it going? And what happens is people start telling you how it's going, sort of the good, the bad, and the ugly, but they start helping each other. Oh, I ran into that issue, here's how I plowed it down. So you're creating this body of work about how not only did it go, but people start helping each other if there's any issues, and the leaders have real-time feedback. This is not wait 3 months and find out. So again, the application of technology here is powerful. We also, through the social listening tools of IBM, we can do change analytics or social listening analytics. So we can listen across all of those instant messages, all across the BuzzFeed of the company, what's going on in the social sphere of the company, and we can pull out what are people saying about this project, what are people saying about this new process. And so we could actually sit back and analyze the conversations going on in the social stratosphere of the company in terms of what's going on. It's really powerful. And then the last thing I'll say about applying technology here is that we're getting more and more into this field, all of our companies, about big data and analytics, and we started scratching our heads saying, how could we use analytics to help us be smarter about how we stage and manage change? And one of the biggest issues in many companies today is there's a lot of change going on. It's not just one thing. And how much change is hitting the same people, change saturation, change fatigue. I mean, all the terms are out there, right? So how do you actually know how much change is going to be hitting certain categories, certain personas of workers or roles in your company? And so we actually have created techniques now that we can actually visualize how much change will be hitting certain groups of employees in certain countries, in certain quarters, so we can kind of begin to look at, oh wow, did you know 17 things are going to hit our sales team in Germany in first quarter? Maybe we should think about staging and managing that as a collection of change rather than just each project on their own, right? So we're doing that kind of work as well.
I mean, I've heard now what you've done at IBM and a few other companies having these kind of heat maps to actually try and assess as you said, sort of the saturation level or the capability level to take on new work. So that the technology is aiding you to do that.
Todd, can I actually touch on that point for a minute? I think we do some of this. We certainly are not as mature as IBM, and so that's why it was easy for me to defer the question to Nancy. But there's a couple of things that are happening environmentally that I think we need to care for. That technology won't even address. And one of them is, as Nancy pointed out, the volume of change. And I don't know what your leader's receptivity to, we should slow down that project, or we should not do that, or these people are already going through a number of things. But in my experience over years at a number of different companies, leaders don't take too kindly to the idea of their project being the one that's delayed because people are dealing with too many other things at the same time. And so this starts to be the practicality of how you take what you learn and apply it in a real world corporate setting that's trying to drive revenue and create the best possible customer experience. And so you have to find other ways around that. If we're not going to slow down the change, if we're not going to reduce the number of times that this employee has to make modifications to the way they work, what's the other variable there? Because as far as I can tell, there's two variables. You decrease the volume of change, or you increase people's ability to deal effectively with that change. And so this speaks to this proactive nature of, let's not manage all of the changes, but let's, from a leadership perspective, look at a way to build a capability across an organization, again, not to manage project change work, but to say, how do we create a more resilient workforce? How do we create a more change-capable organization that can roll a bit more with the changes that are taking place and the speed at which they're happening? Which brings me to my other point around Steve's experience at Goldman. And Steve, I'm speaking out of turn, so I'll be interested in your reaction to this. But what it sounds like much of what you're describing is much more of an evolutionary change, where you kind of look up and say, oh, we didn't see this, all of a sudden you look around and you're like, this is where we ended up? I didn't know this is where we were going to be, which is part of our role to help say, wait a minute, let's look up and see where we're at, and are we still moving in the right direction? Today, what's happening in the marketplace doesn't allow for evolutionary change. These projects that are 18, 36, 48 months long, by the time you get halfway through, the world has changed in such a way that it's an out-of-date idea, and you have to abandon the project or the change, which creates a learned behavior among your workforce that nothing ever actually gets done. We're going to make a big announcement about something, but then we're not going to do it, and if I just duck down, it'll blow over, and I never have to even think differently about it, which is not the kind of attitude or conditioning that you want among your employees. And so we can't do these long projects anymore because things change too quickly. So it's our responsibility to look for ways to help employees change on a dime like this. So how do you decrease their threat around whatever it is? How do you make them, how do you increase personal agility in some of these very individual things so that some of these timely issues don't start to surface for us?
You want to react to that?
Well, I was just going to say, well, on these change, I think after having worked at Goldman for a long time and having spent time with McKinsey during the credit crisis, I then became the chief of staff to the president at Citigroup. And I went from two organizations that had sort of a partnership culture mentality. So the incentive was, I own a percentage in the firm. My percentage is not going up, so the only thing I can do is, my incentive is, let's work together and make the pie bigger. In these larger organizations, this is the one thing I learned at Citi was, what's their incentive to change, right? Because they care about themselves, their group, their department. So all these big announcements by the CEO, I think as you pointed out, everyone's like, yes, 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 sounds great. They know the CEO is going to be gone in 3 years. The project's going to be gone. No problem. I just want to get home by 6. So I always ask people now, whenever they start talking about change, I'm like, what's the incentive for the people to change? And I think that although there's technology and this collaboration, it's a little bit easier. I think people genuinely want to help to do what's best for the firm. I think there's this, maybe I see the good in people, but I think they want to help, but everyone is busy with their own things, and in the end they care about themselves or their group, and that's how they get paid. So I always ask, how are they going to, why
It's a
change?
true banker speak. I mean, you can,
Yeah.
you can take the banker out of the bank, but you can't take the banker out of him.
Yeah. I just wanted to comment on that and say that, many companies like IBM, our people are very invested in these changes. They see it as an opportunity for them to grow their skills, their expertise into new areas, growth areas. That's exciting for them. But they also have incentives in terms of, how they are, at the end of the year, rewarded on IBM's performance. So, they are very invested in the success of the firm as well as their individual metrics that they're held to. So, I think that's how we get some balance in the system there. But
All right, well, I'm going to open it up for questions because you've been very patient. You've stayed the whole day, and I think this panel is very rich. So there's lots of good stuff. Can we bring the mic up to the back, right behind you there first, and then I'll come up front next. Thank you.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Adobe. I work at IBM. Actually, my question is directed to Lauren. How do you then, you said something, you're like, okay, you want to drive business results, you want to engage customers, right? You want a better customer experience. But then you want to also get people resilient to change. How do you deal with the employee experience in that equation? Because yes, experiences matter, and I think that's IDEO's big thing, right? They want to get satisfying experiences, but I don't hear anyone talking about we are the change agents as the employees. How do you deal with that customer experience, as our experience as employees, to drive the results you want?
So we have I think I'll echo Nancy's remarks that by and large, Verizon's employee base is very rallied around creating the best possible customer experience. And so there's a North Star, and no one is confused about what that is. And so the goal then is to find out, how do you harness that commitment and drive changes in that direction, while at the same time making sure that what you're doing is aligned to incentives so that you can care for the natural kind of human response to change. So employees are heavily engaged in what we do. We have a powerful voice of employee engine that we use to not only collect insights from our employees, but also it gives us an opportunity to leaders can put out challenges, as Nancy was describing, and so we can engage them in the process early, get their voices in, get their opinions heard, and we do as much as we can to include them in the change process along the way, because at the end of the day, we have so many people touching our customers every day, and so we want to make sure that as we drive change internally, that it doesn't disrupt their ability to deliver a great experience externally.
Thank you. Another question?
Hi, Ross Tartell. I teach adjunct across the street at Teachers College. The question in a lot of organization development and organizational change processes is the values underlying those change processes. So given the format of this conference, how do ethics play through that? And what role do they play, and how do they play out in your practice? And certainly at Goldman, because Stephen, when you were talking about the 12 principles, and suddenly they're saying, who thinks that customers come first at Goldman? That's part of the ethics and the values in that.
I'm happy to jump in on this one. The change agenda for our company, which obviously is always around serving the client experience, all those things, and the strategy of the company is the first thing that informs the change agenda. The financial roadmap of the company, and the core values. Those are sort of the three underlying things that really inform the change agenda. How will we enable the great client experiences? How will we enable growth? How will we enable productivity and become world-class at what it is that we're doing? The core values we think of as a lot more than ethics. We have business conduct guidelines as a company that we all adhere to, that is sort of the ethical underpinning of our company. And every year we recertify on those. But for us, the core values are much more than that. The core values are what really should inform our decision-making, how we show up and work together, how we serve our clients together. And again, in 2003, Sam Palmisano, our CEO at the time, said, look, after 90 years of having a set of core values as a company, it's probably time to refresh them and contemporize them. And he invited all the employees of the company onto the company intranet to have a massive online chat about what our core values should become. And we refreshed our core values. We call them IBMers values. They are the underpinning of the organization. So no matter where you show up for IBM every day in your home office, no matter what country, what role, et cetera, what business unit, you're basically ascribing to the 3 core values, which is number 1, dedication to every client's success. We show up working on our client's agenda. Number 2, innovation that matters for our company and the world. We can work on a lot of cool things, but we work on innovation that will matter. And number 3, trust and personal responsibility in all relationships. And we've been working to make those 3 core values part of the fabric of the company, our operations and behaviors. And this March, our current CEO, Ginny Rometty, engaged the whole IBM workforce, again, in another jam on our on client experience and on our core values. We had a massive storytelling going on for 3 or 4 days across the company about IBM at our best. When we show up together to serve our clients at our best, what does that look like? And so now we've taken the 3 core values and have articulated a set of practices around that. So again, we are doing lots of storytelling around these practices, how we're showing up, how we're bringing them to life. Culture is an ongoing journey. It's an ongoing piece of work that you have to do if, in fact, you want your workforce to be differentiated by how they show up and highlight how they create these differentiating client experiences. So,
on ethics, what I found was in 1979 when they said we always put our clients' interests first, that meant something to the people then. It was understood and socialized and taught to them, and it meant something that was a higher than the legal standard in terms of ethics. That was supported by the fact it was a less complex organization. It was a partnership where the partners had personal liability. And what's happened over time is that has moved to the legal standard. So it was here and it's moved to the legal standard. So why did it move to the legal standard? Well, as you're growing and you become more complex, it's harder to tell and socialize people what exactly we always put our clients' interests first means. And you want to maximize the opportunity set that you have to make money and grow. So what happens is your ethical standard moves, and part of that was supported by the fact that they had gone public and so no longer had personal legal liability. Goes to a legal standard. And so that's why Goldman Sachs executives today, when they say they always put their clients' interests first, and they truly honestly believe that, to them that really means what Lloyd Blankfein said in his congressional testimony. We fulfilled all of our legal responsibilities to our clients. All the legal duties that we had to our clients, we fulfilled. And based on the lawsuits and everything else that have been dropped against Goldman, that has basically proven itself out. So today, they believe that putting their client's interests first means that they've disclosed all the risk factors. That's their legal duty. They have a fiduciary duty to their shareholders. They do not have a fiduciary duty to most of their clients. In some businesses, they do. And so, therefore, the meaning of those words changed, in my opinion, to accommodate these pressures in order for them to adjust and compete and to grow and everything else. And so I'm not saying whether or not that's good or bad. I'm just explaining why did it happen and how did it happen.
We have one more question. Oh, it looks like we have a few more questions. All right, we'll have to be quick with questions and quick with answers. Okay, thank you.
Hi, I'm John Gordon from New York Presbyterian Hospital. Nancy, I was actually most struck by what you were just mentioning a moment ago, which is that you had this massive online jam to define your core values. We rewrote our strategic initiatives at the hospital, and it was me and a handful of other people that did it. We're not an organization configured to accept that, sort of have that open dialogue. I don't think our leadership thinks that way. And I feel like some of that comes, or a lot of it comes from just the practice of medicine, the way it's been run, is that physicians aren't taught that way. They're not open to a lot of sort of people questioning them and having discussions. Frankly, I think to the detriment of care in a lot of cases. So how do you take an organization that's configured that way and make it more open to listening to those voices?
You know, the first time we did one of these jams was when we did the refresh of our core values in 2003. And we had just come through a decade of extreme change. We had come from late 80s, early 90s. We had a near-death experience as a company. We had to really rebuild ourselves as an organization. And a lot had changed about our company. And I think, I really credit Sam Palmisano with this as a CEO saying, I could sit here and craft these with my senior team. It's time to refresh the core values. We can all feel it. Let's ask our employees, because there's this feeling that, like your organizations, we hire really smart people, and they want to be creative and they want to contribute. And we wanted this to be, if again, you don't think you can show up every day telling people exactly what to do, you want them to come up with the core values that are going to inform their actions, their decisions, and their behaviors. So it was really a very trusting action on his part to say, I'm going to throw this open, and we gave it some guidance. Obviously, we think we need some core values in these areas, and people started contributing energy to it. There's a Harvard Business Review article that's been written on this that Sam Palmisano did called Leading Change When Business is Good, and you should read it, because what it says is in the first 72 hours of the jam being on, it wasn't going so well. I mean, there was some really rough stuff, and a lot of CEOs might have turned it off at that point and said, oops, bad idea. But Sam didn't do that. He left it on. He let some rough stuff come out. I mean, people were reflecting on the last decade of change. Some people had lost their jobs. IBM had, made some profound changes, and Sam and others and other IBM employees got online at that point and said, hang on a second. We had to make some tough choices to sustain the enterprise. We now want to look forward. Help us look forward. And the conversation shifted. So it was a very trusting thing for him to do, and what came out of it, and these words that were selected through the words of our employees, are so powerful. And we've acquired 140 companies in the last 10 years. I speak to a lot of leaders in IBM. None of them think we have the wrong core values. They say these are exactly what we're about as a company, whether we came from IBM legacy or we've come in through some other companies. The question is, how do you then put them into action? And Ginny this year, when she ran the jam to translate those values into IBM at its best, what are the practices around those? 250,000 IBMers went on and contributed their ideas. And by the way, when you go in a jam, your name and your picture comes up. And people are very courageous in IBM about saying what's on their minds, the good, the bad, and the ugly, right? And that's, I think, a good thing to have going on in an organization. Organizations are becoming more open, more social, more collaborative, and this is a real leap for our leaders to move in that direction.
Well, I've been sort of guided to the fact that we're at 2:30, so I need to close up. I just want to say that as a change management, whatever I am, expert for the last 30 years, I felt like I learned a lot this afternoon from the three of you. And in fact, I felt like a kid in a candy store. And Steve, thanks for your very thoughtful observations about what was going on at Goldman Sachs. Nancy, you've got not only your 38 and a half years of experience, but also these years now of building a capability, and I think really being a trendsetter for all of corporations. And next to me is Lauren, who is building from scratch this function with kind of a whole excitement of a startup, but also all the uncertainties associated with it. And we got a glimpse into what she's doing. So we had three very interesting folks this afternoon. I hope you'll agree. And I did leave this last slide up because I think they represent the hope for the future. And maybe when my next edition of my Managing Change book comes out, I'll change it to Leading Change, since you like that better. I was at a book launch last night, not my book, called The Science of Change, so we're trying to actually make it into a science. So whatever the indicators are, we're trying to do more with this profession. And I think the representatives here, through varying ways, have demonstrated to us we do indeed have hope going forward. Thank you so much for joining us for this session.
Well, we just wanted to say thank you, everyone, for coming. We're in the closing few minutes here, If you remember in the beginning, one of the words I used a lot was dialogue, and I hope that doesn't end at 2:40, our sort of stopping point, that we continue amongst one another, and hopefully for future events as well. Like Todd, I learned a lot. I promised I would be taking notes, and I have several pages of notes in here, and hopefully some contacts, and I hope you also had a very similar experience. Thank you again for coming, and I'm going to hand over to Bruce for the...
Thank you. First, it was a lot of fun to work with Damon and always Sandra on this project. Damon has written a book on jazz. You saw that in his PowerPoint slide, which is on sale, the right places. But it's kind of cool to work with a guy who works on jazz. So I was happy to have that partnership. But it also working with Todd and other people on this conference, you kind of learn how hard this stuff is, and you certainly got this in the last panel. And I'm glad I don't teach it because it's be too much work. Just be.
It's a lot of fun.
It's a lot of fun. I'm sure that's true, but it's also very important for us as an organization. So where did this idea come from? I think I maybe hinted at this earlier or said it. I was away last year, and Sonia Navali, who co-directs the Bernstein Center, was shooting me emails, occasionally Skype, said, things are happening, the school went through a little bit of a bumpy road on the ratings, that kind of stuff, and so on. So this was kind of the background to what I was saying earlier. But the school really did pull itself together on a number of topics. Geeta Johar is not here right now, but I do feel that this issue of whether it's top or whether it's down below is always sort of a cultural issue, and the school had been pretty, as this university is, pretty high in the top down, and really made a transition over the past 6 months with a lot more faculty involvement and a lot more change occurring, and I think the results have been remarkable, and there's a lot of ownership over this process. So it's hard to get academics who are trained in what we're trained in to actually buy into what we heard today, but when it actually improves your life, makes things better, it goes a long way towards persuasion. We have some people to thank here. I was very happy to see Emily Moon back with us. She's become much more expensive in her labor over the past year or two, but she still helps us. Heather, I'm not sure if she's is still here, but yes, Heather was, and also Tiffany. Tiffany, you in the room right there waving, who does so much. She has this background in event management, and I'm so impressed by all that. But it means that I have to keep to her schedule right now, and I hope I'm doing well, Tiffany. And of course, I mentioned to you earlier, Sandra, on these issues. Most of from both of us, most of our thanks are to the people who came. Thank you again. We have some people who stayed and people who've been with us for a long period of time across our conferences, and also to the people like Todd and the last panel and the earlier speakers who spoke here. I did hear a rumor that the lunch speaker, Tony Marks, actually was Alex Baldwin, but that's not true. It actually was the head of the New York Public Library. I'm sure you heard that one before. Okay, thanks very much for coming. We'll see you again at the next conference.